While visiting my parents in another city, I got a text from an unknown number. Man, I'm sorry. I didn't know she was engaged. She invited me to your house herself. 5 hours later, I walked into my house. She smiled and greeted me like nothing happened. Then I was in my parents' kitchen when the message arrived, leaning against the counter with a mug of reheated coffee that tasted like nothing. The city was quiet in that way unfamiliar places get late at night, when even the fridge hum sounds foreign. My father had gone to bed early after a long day of post-surgery exhaustion, and my mother was asleep on the couch with the television still on, volume low, the light flickering over her face. I remember thinking I would answer one more email, then turn in myself, because the morning was going to start early again. The phone vibrated once, sharp and deliberate, not like a notification from an app. I looked down and saw a number I did not recognize. Different area code. No contact photo. No context. Just a single message sitting there, heavy in a way words should not be able to manage. The message explained, without drama and without insults, that the sender had been invited to my house by my fiancée, that he had not known she was engaged, and that he felt obligated to say something now that he understood what was actually happening. He mentioned my house specifically, not vaguely, and described how she framed the situation as temporary and uncomplicated. He said he would not have crossed that line if he had known the truth earlier. He added that he was not trying to cause trouble and that he was stepping away completely. I stood there longer than made sense, staring at the screen, rereading it slowly, not because I needed clarity, but because my brain was buying time. The room around me felt unchanged, which was wrong. Nothing had moved. The fridge still hummed. The television murmured. But the structure underneath everything had shifted, and my body had not caught up yet. At first, I assumed it was a scam. People send messages like that sometimes, fishing for reactions, hoping to start something messy. The wording was calm, almost restrained, which made it suspicious in a different way. There was no demand, no accusation, no follow-up. Just an explanation and an apology. That absence of aggression unsettled me more than anger would have. I checked the timestamp. It was recent. Too recent to be something old resurfacing. I checked the number again, then the area code. It matched my city. Not my parents' city. Mine. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I locked my phone and set it face down on the counter as if it might move on its own. I rinsed the mug even though I had barely touched the coffee. The water ran too loudly. I turned it off and leaned both hands on the sink, breathing through my nose, forcing my shoulders to stay loose. Sabrina and I had been together long enough that surprises were rare. We had routines that overlapped neatly, habits that filled in the gaps. I knew when she woke up, when she got quiet, when she left cabinets open without realizing it. I knew which light she forgot to turn off. We shared a house, a future plan, a calendar that lived on both our phones. There was no space in that picture for an unknown number explaining access to my home. I unlocked my phone again and reread the message, this time paying attention to the details I had skipped the first time. The sender mentioned the back entrance instead of the front, something only someone who had actually been there would think to specify. He mentioned the way the hallway light flickered before fully turning on. That light had been flickering for months, and I had kept forgetting to replace the switch. My chest tightened, not sharply, but steadily, like pressure increasing in a sealed container. I finally replied with a short acknowledgement, neutral and controlled, asking how long ago this had happened and why he was contacting me now. I did not accuse. I did not ask questions that would tip my hand. I kept it factual, the way you do when you need information more than comfort. The response came faster than I expected. He explained the timeline without embellishment. He said he had believed her when she said the situation was unresolved but ending, that the house was hers for the time being, that the engagement was something she had already mentally moved past. He said he noticed inconsistencies over time, enough to step back, and that he had learned about the engagement indirectly, not from her. That was when he decided to reach out. I asked for clarification about dates. He answered. I asked whether anyone else knew. He said no. I asked whether he still had access to the house. He said he did not, and that he had never been given a key, only temporary access. Temporary access. I locked the phone again and walked quietly down the hallway to the guest room. My parents' house was unfamiliar enough that I had to move carefully, memorizing where the floor creaked. I sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of it press into my legs, grounding me. There was a version of events where this was still explainable, where context made it less severe. I listed those versions methodically, like checking boxes. Misunderstanding. Old connection resurfacing briefly. Poor communication. But each explanation required me to ignore the precision of the message and the lack of incentive behind it. I opened the shared home app on my phone, the one we used for basic utilities and monitoring. I wasn't looking for proof, just anomalies. The activity log loaded slowly, then filled the screen with routine entries. Lights. Thermostat changes. Door activity. I scrolled back. There were entries that did not match what Sabrina had told me during our recent calls. Minor things. Temperature adjustments at odd hours. Lights turning on and off in patterns that didn't fit her usual habits. None of it was conclusive on its own, but together they formed an outline that didn't belong to me. I checked the garage access next. Nothing blatant. Then the guest Wi-Fi log. A device name I didn't recognize appeared intermittently over the past week. It could have been anything, but my stomach dropped anyway. I set the phone down and leaned back against the headboard. My breathing was still controlled, but my thoughts were accelerating, stacking on top of each other too fast to sort cleanly. I realized I was more focused on logistics than emotion, and that worried me in a delayed way. Shock, maybe, or something adjacent to it. Sabrina had texted earlier that evening, asking how my parents were doing, using the same familiar tone she always did. I opened that thread and reread her messages from the past few days. Nothing stood out immediately. No sudden distance. No overcompensation. Just normalcy, which now felt artificial. I looked at the time. It was late enough that calling her would feel intrusive, and early enough that waiting would feel unbearable. I chose neither. Instead, I opened the airline app and searched for flights back home. There was one leaving early in the morning, not ideal, but workable. Another later that afternoon. I booked the earliest one without hesitation. The confirmation email came through, bright and impersonal. I forwarded it to myself on my other account and archived it. I did not tell Sabrina. I lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling, noticing a faint crack near the corner that I hadn't seen before. My body finally started to react then, not with panic, but with a deep, slow tension that settled into my muscles. I thought about the house, about how familiar it was, how much of my routine lived there. I thought about what it meant for someone else to move through that space under false pretenses. At some point, I drifted into a shallow sleep, the kind that doesn't reset anything. When my alarm went off a few hours later, I turned it off immediately and sat up, already alert. There was no grogginess, no confusion, just a clear, sharp awareness that something had changed and that I was moving toward it. The drive to the airport passed in fragments. Streetlights. Empty intersections. The radio playing softly without registering. At the terminal, I moved through security with mechanical efficiency, my bag lighter than it should have felt. I checked my phone once more. No new messages from the unknown number. No missed calls from Sabrina. On the plane, I took the window seat and watched the city pull away beneath the wing. I did not think about confronting anyone yet. I focused on sequence. Arrival. Entry. Observation. Information. Reaction would come later. 5 hours after that first message, I would walk into my house. I didn't know yet how calm Sabrina would seem, or how convincingly normal everything would look on the surface. I only knew that whatever version of my life I had left behind in my parents' kitchen no longer existed in the same shape, and I was already too far in to turn back. The taxi dropped me off 2 houses down from mine, not because I asked, but because traffic slowed suddenly and the driver decided it was close enough. I didn't correct him. I paid, stepped out, and stood still for a moment with my bag at my feet, looking at my own house from a distance I had never used before. It felt unfamiliar that way, like observing someone else's life through glass. The porch light was on. Sabrina almost never turned it on during the day, and it was still early afternoon. That detail alone didn't mean anything, but it registered anyway. The lawn looked recently watered, darker patches cutting through the grass in uneven arcs. The trash bin was pulled closer to the garage than I remembered leaving it. I picked up my bag and walked the rest of the way. The front door opened before I reached for the handle. Sabrina stood there already smiling, relaxed posture, shoulders loose, wearing the sweatshirt she liked to steal from me when the weather dipped. Her hair was pulled back casually, not styled, not rushed. She stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me as if my arrival had been expected at this exact time. She smelled normal. Clean laundry, citrus soap. No trace of panic or surprise. I returned the hug without hesitation, my arms moving automatically, my face settling into something neutral and warm. I didn't rush the moment or cut it short. I let it look natural, because that was safer than reacting too quickly. She commented on the flight, on my parents, on how quiet the house had been without me. Her voice had the same rhythm it always did, steady and unforced. If there was tension, it was buried too deep to surface immediately. Inside, the house felt staged. Not in a dramatic way, not spotless or rearranged, but curated. Shoes were lined up more carefully than usual. The coffee table was cleared except for one book, centered. The air smelled faintly of cleaning solution, something she usually avoided because it irritated her sinuses. I set my bag down near the stairs and took in the space with deliberate slowness, letting my eyes move naturally, not scanning like an investigator, but noticing like someone returning home. The hallway light flickered when she turned it on, just like always. We moved into the kitchen, and she started talking about a recipe she wanted to try later in the week, something that required ingredients we didn't usually buy. She opened the fridge to show me a list on her phone. That was when I noticed the extra shelf reorganized, drinks placed in pairs instead of singles, a brand I never bought sitting behind the milk. I didn't comment. I asked casual questions instead, about her week, about work, about whether the neighbor's dog was still barking at night. She answered smoothly, too smoothly, without pauses or corrections. The conversation flowed, but it felt rehearsed in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. At one point, she mentioned spending most evenings alone, catching up on shows. She referenced a series we had started together and claimed she hadn't watched ahead. That detail stood out because the streaming app on my phone showed recent activity that didn't match her timeline. I nodded anyway. We sat at the kitchen island, the same spots we always used. She reached for my hand briefly, squeezed, then let go, as if checking a box. I watched the gesture more than I felt it. After a while, I excused myself to unpack. She offered to help, then stopped herself, saying she'd start prepping dinner instead. That hesitation was subtle, but it landed hard. She didn't follow me upstairs. In the bedroom, the bed was made differently. Not wrong, just different. The pillows were arranged symmetrically instead of casually stacked. The extra throw blanket was folded instead of draped. I opened the closet and saw that my clothes were untouched, but the spacing between hangers felt tighter, compressed as if someone else had been navigating around them. I unpacked slowly, placing items down deliberately, listening for movement below. I heard cabinets opening, the faucet running. Normal sounds. Still, my awareness stayed elevated, like a low-grade alarm that refused to turn off. When I went back downstairs, Sabrina was chopping vegetables with careful precision. She asked whether I wanted a drink. I said water. She filled a glass from the tap, added ice without asking, then slid it across the counter. The ice clinked louder than it should have. While she cooked, I wandered into the living room and sat down, picking up the book from the coffee table. It wasn't hers or mine. It wasn't something either of us would normally read. There was no bookmark, but the spine was creased in a way that suggested repeated handling. I set it back down exactly where it had been. A knock came at the door. Sabrina froze for a fraction of a second. Not long enough to be obvious, but long enough for me to notice. She recovered quickly, wiping her hands on a towel and heading toward the door with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. It was a neighbor, an older man from 2 houses down, holding a misdelivered package. He apologized for the inconvenience, made a comment about how busy things had seemed around here lately. He gestured vaguely toward the driveway. Sabrina laughed lightly and said she hadn't noticed anything unusual. The neighbor shrugged and left, but the comment stayed suspended in the air after the door closed. Dinner was quiet, but not tense. Sabrina talked more than usual, filling space with small updates and future plans. She mentioned a weekend trip idea that assumed nothing had changed. I let her talk. I asked a few questions to keep the rhythm steady. After we ate, I offered to do the dishes. She hesitated again, then agreed. While I stood at the sink, I watched her reflection in the darkened window. She moved restlessly, checking her phone more often than she realized, responding to messages with the screen angled away from me. Later that evening, when she went upstairs to shower, I sat alone on the couch and pulled my phone out. I messaged the unknown number again, asking a direct question this time. How many times had he been here? The reply came almost immediately. More than once. Always when she said the house was empty. Never overnight. Never with anyone else present. I asked whether she had ever mentioned me by name. He said no. That answer carried more weight than anything else so far. I put the phone down and stared at the wall, tracing a faint scuff mark near the baseboard I'd meant to clean months ago. I thought about the way Sabrina had greeted me, the way she had spoken about being alone, the way the house had been arranged to look untouched. When she came back downstairs, hair damp, wearing comfortable clothes, she sat beside me and leaned her head on my shoulder. I rested my arm along the back of the couch without pulling her closer. She talked about a minor issue at work, something trivial, something designed to sound authentic. I listened without interrupting, nodding at appropriate moments. At some point, she asked if everything was okay, if I seemed tired. I said the trip had been longer than expected and that I just needed a night to reset. She accepted that explanation easily. We went to bed at the usual time. I lay awake long after her breathing evened out, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly above us. Every familiar sound felt altered, like hearing a song you know well played in a different key. I didn't confront her. Not yet. What mattered now was understanding the shape of the lie, not reacting to it. The house wasn't just a setting anymore. It was evidence. It was a shared space that had been repurposed without my knowledge, then carefully restored. By morning, I knew one thing with certainty. This hadn't been a momentary lapse. It had been managed. And that meant the next step couldn't be emotional. It had to be precise. Morning arrived without ceremony. Light slipped through the blinds in narrow bands, touching the dresser, the edge of the bed, the wall where we had once argued about paint colors and never decided. Sabrina woke before I did, or at least pretended to. I heard her phone vibrate softly, then the mattress shift as she sat up and turned away. When she finally stood, her steps were careful, measured, as if the floor itself might betray her. I stayed still until the shower started. When the bathroom door closed, the house changed character. The sounds became clearer, sharper, no longer buffered by performance. I got up and moved through the bedroom without rushing, opening drawers that were technically shared but practically hers. Nothing obvious. Everything curated. The absence of disorder felt intentional. Downstairs, I made coffee and checked the calendar pinned to the fridge. It was full of future plans written in her handwriting, trips, deadlines, reminders that assumed continuity. I photographed it with my phone, not as evidence, but as a record of how far the illusion had already extended. While the coffee brewed, I opened the financial app we both used for household expenses. I had avoided it the night before because I wanted sleep more than certainty. Now I wanted clarity. The account showed normal activity at first glance. Bills paid on time. Groceries within range. But when I filtered by merchant and frequency, patterns emerged. Purchases that didn't align with her routine. Small amounts, consistent intervals, the kind of spending designed not to stand out. I cross-checked dates against the timeline the unknown man had given me. They matched. The realization didn't arrive as shock. It arrived as alignment, like two images snapping into place. This wasn't recklessness. It was maintenance. She had budgeted for deception the same way she budgeted for groceries. Sabrina came downstairs dressed for work, composed, her hair still damp at the ends. She greeted me cheerfully, kissed my cheek, asked if I wanted anything before she left. I said no. She lingered for a moment, searching my face for something, then grabbed her bag and headed out. As soon as the door closed, I locked it. I sat at the table and messaged the man again, asking whether he was willing to meet briefly, somewhere public, no confrontation, just confirmation. He hesitated, then agreed, suggesting a cafe halfway between our neighborhoods. I set a time for later that afternoon. Before leaving the house, I walked through each room slowly, not looking for dramatic proof, but documenting condition and access. I photographed the door locks, the garage keypad, the router setup. I noted which devices were connected. I reset nothing yet. This phase was about understanding, not intervention. At the cafe, the man arrived early and chose a table near the window. He looked ordinary, younger than I expected, with the posture of someone trying not to draw attention. He stood when he saw me, then sat again quickly, hands folded, eyes tired. We kept the exchange factual. He explained how he met Sabrina, how she framed her situation, how she controlled availability carefully. She avoided weekends. She avoided overnight stays. She emphasized privacy and timing. She never let him see personal documents or photos that included me. She never used my name. He showed me messages on his phone. Not romantic declarations, not explicit promises, but logistical coordination dressed up as casual connection. The tone was consistent with someone managing parallel narratives. I asked why he believed her. He said she spoke with confidence, and that confidence came with details that sounded lived in rather than fabricated. She talked about the house as if it were hers alone. She talked about future uncertainty in a way that invited sympathy without commitment. When we stood to leave, he apologized again, not theatrically, but with the weight of someone who understood consequences had already started moving. We parted without animosity. Back in my car, I didn't sit there processing. I drove. The next stop was the bank. I spoke with the representative and explained that I needed to temporarily restrict shared discretionary access pending review. I didn't accuse anyone. I framed it as precautionary. The process was straightforward. A few confirmations. A few signatures. The change went into effect immediately. From there, I called a legal office recommended by a colleague months earlier for an unrelated matter. I asked about disengagement protocols, asset separation, occupancy rights. The answers were clinical, structured, unemotional. I wrote everything down. By the time I returned home, the sun had shifted enough to change the way the living room looked. Sabrina's shoes were still by the door, aligned carefully. The house still performed innocence well. When she came back that evening, I was already there. She noticed the difference immediately, not because anything had moved, but because my attention had changed. I wasn't reacting to her anymore. I was observing. We sat at the table. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I laid out the timeline piece by piece. not as a story, but as a sequence of verifiable facts. Dates, access patterns, financial inconsistencies, third-party confirmation. Her first response was disbelief, rehearsed confusion. When that didn't hold, it shifted to justification, to reframing, to minimizing language that tried to turn management into misunderstanding. I didn't interrupt. When she realized denial wasn't working, she tried recalibration. She framed the situation as exploratory rather than deceptive, as something contained, something she intended to end. She suggested the engagement was still real, still intact. I told her that the engagement depended on mutual reality, not intention. She went quiet then, recalculating. I could see it in the way her shoulders tightened, in the way she stopped trying to read my expression and started measuring outcomes instead. I explained what I had already put in motion. Temporary access restrictions, consultation, documentation, not as threats, but as statements of fact. Her reaction wasn't anger. It was fear, not of losing me emotionally, but of losing control of the structure she had built. The house, the finances, the narrative. Those were the pillars she had relied on, and they were no longer aligned. She asked what I wanted. I said clarity, separation, and time. She asked where she was supposed to go. I said we would discuss logistics later, with parameters defined. That night, she slept in the guest room. I stayed in the bedroom and listened to the house settle around me, the familiar creaks and hums returning to their old rhythms. The place felt different now, not violated, but reclaimed. Knowledge had changed the geometry of the space. Before sleeping, I sent one final message to the man, letting him know I had handled it and that he didn't need to involve himself further. He replied with a short acknowledgement and then nothing. The silence afterward felt earned. By morning, the situation had passed a threshold. There was no version of this that returned to normal. Whatever came next would be administrative, legal, social. Emotional fallout would follow later, but the framework was already set. This wasn't about catching someone in the act. It was about dismantling a system that had been quietly running alongside my life. And now that system no longer had a power source. The morning after the confrontation felt quieter than it should have. Not peaceful, not calm, just emptied of background noise. Sabrina moved through the house carefully, as if sound itself might escalate things. She avoided eye contact, spoke only when necessary, and kept her phone close without using it much. The guest room door stayed closed longer than usual, then opened slowly, like a concession rather than a choice. I made breakfast without asking whether she wanted any. She didn't come into the kitchen. That separation, physical and procedural, set the tone for everything that followed. By mid-morning, I began implementing what I had already outlined. I changed the primary access codes to the garage and smart locks, not dramatically, not in front of her, but systematically. I disabled shared device permissions and updated passwords for utilities and home systems. Each change was logged, each action reversible only through formal steps. This wasn't retaliation. It was boundary enforcement. Sabrina watched from the hallway at one point, arms folded, her posture tense but contained. She didn't protest. She asked whether this was necessary. I said it was. The legal consultation from the day before turned into documentation that afternoon. I reviewed everything again, making sure I understood the sequence. Notice, separation, occupancy terms, asset delineation. The process was neither fast nor theatrical, which made it effective. There was no single moment where everything collapsed. It was more like pressure releasing through multiple controlled exits. I told Sabrina she would need to make arrangements to leave within a defined time frame. I didn't demand immediacy. I gave structure. She asked if this was final. I said yes. That word landed harder than any raised voice could have. Her response wasn't explosive. It was practical in the wrong way. She asked about logistics first, about where she could store things, about what she could take immediately. She asked whether the shared account would remain accessible. I explained that it was under review and that discretionary spending was paused. I offered to cover basic transitional expenses under documented terms. She nodded, already recalculating. That afternoon, her phone started ringing more often. She didn't answer most calls, but I recognized the pattern. Messages came in waves, then stopped, then resumed. At one point, she stepped outside to take a call and stayed there longer than expected. When she came back in, her face was tight, not angry, but strained. She told me people were confused. I said confusion was the natural result of overlapping stories. By the next day, the social consequences began materializing without my involvement. Plans were canceled. Invitations went unanswered. A mutual acquaintance reached out to me directly, careful with wording, asking whether everything was okay. I responded with a brief statement confirming the engagement had ended and that I wasn't discussing details. That alone did enough work. Sabrina's parents called that evening. I didn't answer. Not because I couldn't, but because there was nothing to explain yet. Explanations invite negotiation, and this phase required finality. They left a voicemail asking for clarification, expressing concern, suggesting misunderstandings. I archived it. The man who had contacted me initially sent a final message 2 days later, letting me know he had been approached indirectly and had restated that he had been misled and wanted no further involvement. I thanked him and saved the message with the rest of the documentation. After that, the channel closed permanently. Packing started on the 3rd day. Sabrina moved methodically, placing items into boxes with careful labeling, as if she were trying to preserve dignity through organization. I stayed out of her way. I didn't hover or supervise. The house absorbed the activity quietly, the sounds of tape and cardboard replacing the rhythms we once shared. When she finished, she asked whether she could take the book from the coffee table. I said yes. That was the only request I granted verbally. The move-out happened without an audience. No arguments. No last-minute pleas. She loaded the car with the help of a friend who avoided looking at me. When everything was done, Sabrina stood by the door for a moment longer than necessary, as if waiting for something unscripted to happen. Nothing did. She left the keys on the counter and walked out. After the door closed, I locked it and sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where she had slid a glass of water toward me days earlier. The house felt heavier, not with loss, but with the absence of performance. The air was neutral again. Over the following weeks, the administrative work continued. Accounts were separated formally. Legal notices were finalized. The engagement was dissolved on paper the same way it had already been dissolved in practice. There were no dramatic revelations, no public spectacle, just the slow erosion of credibility as timelines failed to align. Sabrina attempted to regain footing through familiar channels, but the structure that had supported her dual narrative no longer existed. Without shared access, without shared space, without the benefit of ambiguity, her options narrowed quickly. People asked questions she couldn't answer consistently. Opportunities closed without explanation. I heard about some of it secondhand. I didn't seek updates. The house changed subtly after she left. I replaced the flickering hallway switch. I rearranged the living room. I donated items we had bought together that no longer made sense in the space. Each adjustment felt corrective rather than emotional. One evening, weeks later, I found the calendar she had left behind, still pinned to the fridge, filled with plans that would never happen. I took it down and folded it carefully before throwing it away. The gesture wasn't symbolic. It was practical. The last interaction came unexpectedly, months later, when a document required her signature to finalize separation terms. She came by briefly, accompanied, and stayed only long enough to sign. We exchanged polite acknowledgments, nothing more. She looked different, not physically, but in posture, as if she were still adapting to a version of reality that didn't bend for her anymore. After she left, I finalized the file and closed it. There was no sense of victory, and no lingering bitterness. What remained was stability rebuilt on verified ground. The house functioned again as a private space, not a shared stage. My routines returned without friction. My attention no longer split between what was happening and what might be hidden beneath it. The message that had started everything sat archived on my phone, untouched. I never deleted it, not out of attachment, but because it marked the moment information overtook assumption. It was the point where the story stopped being something I participated in unknowingly and became something I acted on deliberately. Consequences don't announce themselves. They arrive through process. And once they're in motion, they don't need emotion to finish the job.
I could about how can I get on these flights that just go LA, New York, New York, LA.
Yeah.
That'll solve everything instead of going to all these other cities that were on the East Coast that they wanted me to fly to. And they said, that'll never happen either. These women have decades of seniority. This is their life. They go New York, LA, and they're on 747s and DC 10s. That's it. And I went, there's got to be another way around this. So I just randomly walked into the scheduling office that nobody probably dares to do back in the 70s.